August 19, 1942. The dense jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company wrote in his diary about the shock that swept through Japanese soldiers when they first clashed with American forces. Imi, along with 916 men under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, had just landed after a night insertion by destroyers. Japanese command believed this would be the opening step to recapturing Henderson Field. Their intelligence claimed there were only about 2,000 Americans on the island. Soft, inexperienced, and unprepared. Colonel Ichiki himself brushed aside warnings to wait for reinforcements, telling his officers, "These are Americans. We will drive them into the sea before sunrise." But Ichiki's men, battle-hardened veterans from campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, were about to experience something they had never faced before. It was not just defeat, but the destruction of everything they had been taught to believe about Japanese superiority. The jungle, once seen as an ally, would be turned against them. Night operations, long a Japanese advantage, would backfire, and the Americans, with overwhelming firepower, coordination, and equipment, would demolish the myth that Japanese troops were unbeatable in close combat. The chain of events that led here had started on August 7th. That morning, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point in Operation Watchtower, the first U.S. offensive in the Pacific War. Their mission sounded straightforward: capture the unfinished Japanese airfield, build defenses, and hold out until reinforcements arrived. But reality was far harsher. This campaign would test the Marines to limits they had never faced before. Guadalcanal was no paradise. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, with mountains soaring up to 8,000 feet into thick clouds. Around Henderson Field, the landscape was swamp, kunai grass, and dense jungle. Heat and humidity were suffocating. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick men breathed them in. Streams that looked clean were filled with parasites. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would put more Marines out of action than Japanese bullets. But on that first day, luck was with the Americans. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops on site abandoned the airfield without much resistance, leaving behind equipment and supplies. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already finishing the runway. They named it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Within days, American planes were landing, forming what became known as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response was immediate and brutal. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer in a surprise night attack. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra, were sunk. Over 1,000 sailors were killed in the flaming waters. With supply ships pulling back, the Marines on shore were left stranded with barely half their gear and rations. For the Japanese, one thing became clear. Henderson Field was the key to the entire campaign. Whoever held it controlled the seas during daylight. From Henderson, American planes could hit any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This forced Japan into a deadly pattern. At night, fast destroyers delivered troops and supplies, a tactic nicknamed the Tokyo Express. But at dawn, the skies belonged to American aircraft. Imperial General Headquarters ordered Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake of the 17th Army, based at Rabaul, to retake the airfield. But Hyakutake's available forces were scattered. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, originally slated for the cancelled Midway operation. Ichiki was a skilled instructor and tactician, but also rash and overly confident in Japanese fighting spirit. His orders were clear: wait for the rest of his regiment before attacking. But convinced Americans were weak, he ignored those orders. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers landed 917 of his men east of the American perimeter at Taivu Point. The landing went smoothly, without detection. Ichiki immediately sent patrols to probe Marine defenses. That choice would prove disastrous. The very next morning, August 19th, a Marine patrol led by Captain Charles Brush of Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, encountered Ichiki's men. In a sharp skirmish, the Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents revealing the size of the incoming force. More importantly, the papers showed the Japanese had badly underestimated American strength. Brush rushed back to report. General Alexander Vandegrift quickly realized an attack was imminent, most likely from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to prepare defenses at the sandbar, where the Ilu River, mistakenly called the Tenaru, met the sea. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, set up interlocking machine gun positions along the riverbank. What came next would be remembered as one of the most lopsided battles in the history of the Marine Corps. Colonel Ichiki made a fatal choice. Instead of waiting for word from his missing patrol or for reinforcements, he ordered an immediate attack. On the night of August 20th into the early hours of August 21st, he commanded his men to launch a direct frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine placed faith in night attacks and the power of spirit to overcome superior firepower. Ichiki believed his seasoned veterans could break Marine defenses through sheer determination, bayonets, and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped after being tortured by Japanese soldiers, stumbled into Marine lines with a desperate warning: the Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the assault began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stormed across the sandbar, shouting battle cries, firing rifles, and throwing grenades. But they had charged straight into a perfectly prepared killing zone. The Marines had dug in with M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns, weapons perfected in World War I. Each gun could fire 600 rounds per minute non-stop as long as water cooled the barrel. Positioned to cover every inch of the sandbar, they cut down the attackers in waves. Those who made it across faced 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shells, massive shotgun blasts that shredded anything in their path. The battle raged for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese troops pressed forward. Some reached Marine lines, sparking brutal hand-to-hand fighting with rifles, knives, and even fists. But the defense never cracked. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had collapsed. More than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallows. At sunrise, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began clearing out survivors hiding in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from Marine positions, described the tanks sweeping back and forth, firing bursts of flame and canister shells that tore through groups of Japanese soldiers. By midday, August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Out of 917 men landed at Taivu Point, about 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, most from rear units left near the landing site, retreated into the jungle and reported the disaster to 17th Army headquarters. Colonel Ichiki himself was among the dead. The official record claimed he burned his regimental flag and committed suicide, though some witnesses said he died leading a final charge. Marine losses were about 40 killed and wounded. For Japanese soldiers, the psychological blow was enormous. Documents and later testimony showed how shocked they were that an entire regiment could be destroyed in a single night. The Marines had not fought as Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under night attack. They did not break against mass charges. They had waited calmly in fortified positions, funneled the enemy into kill zones, and annihilated them with concentrated firepower. Even more devastating was the realization of American material superiority. The Browning machine guns never jammed or overheated. Marines carried more ammunition than Japanese units could imagine. Artillery support and naval gunfire coordination gave U.S. forces overwhelming destructive power. The Japanese had never faced such an integrated system of warfare. But Japan was not finished. Within days, more troops were already sailing toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a major naval operation to support the next attempt to seize Henderson Field. On August 16th, 3 transports departed truck, carrying 400 men from the rest of Ichiki's regiment, plus 500 naval infantry. After one transport was heavily damaged in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Japanese commanders abandoned slow transport ships altogether. From then on, they relied on destroyers for rapid supply runs, the Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers delivered nearly 5,000 men from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The system moved soldiers quickly, but it came with a fatal weakness: heavy weapons, vehicles, artillery, and large food supplies could not be carried. Japanese troops arrived with only what they could carry on their backs. Starvation soon became as dangerous as enemy fire. Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his offensive on Henderson Field. His plan was a three-pronged strike. One force would advance along the coast from the west. Another would attack from the south through thick jungle, at what Japanese intelligence assumed was the weakest point in the American perimeter. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main body along a ridge south of Henderson Field, a high ground that overlooked the airfield. What Kawaguchi did not know was that the Marines had already identified the ridge as the most likely route of attack. On September 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, raided Tasimboko village and discovered large Japanese supply dumps. He immediately understood the enemy's plan. The ridge was the key. Edson requested permission to fortify it, and General Vandegrift agreed. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned about 840 Marines from his raiders in the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. With careful preparation, he placed machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire, just as the Marines had done at the Tenaru. The stage was set for one of the most desperate fights of the Guadalcanal Campaign. Mortar teams were already locked onto the most likely routes of attack. Artillery from the 11th Marines had pre-planned fire missions for every possible approach. The ground itself was fully prepared to be turned into a killing field. The ridge was a narrow coral spine, about 1,000 meters long, broken into 3 separate hills with patches of kunai grass and scattered trees. On both sides, deep ravines cut through the jungle, thick with vegetation and nearly impossible to cross in daylight. For infiltrating infantry at night, it seemed perfect. For defenders with heavy firepower, it was an ideal trap. On the night of September 12th, General Kawaguchi's men launched their attack. Unlike Colonel Ichiki's reckless charge at the Tenaru, this was planned with more care. Japanese infantry moved through the ravines on both flanks of the ridge, aiming to encircle the Marines. Small groups probed the defenses, then larger units pushed forward where weaknesses appeared. Fighting erupted across the ridge in chaotic bursts. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found Japanese soldiers crawling so close they could throw grenades or attack hand to hand. But the defenses held. When the Japanese massed for a push, American mortars and artillery rained down. The 11th Marines unleashed more than 2,000 shells that night, exploding so close to friendly lines that shrapnel cut into Marines as well. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red. Individual Marines used everything: rifles, pistols, bayonets, knives, even shovels to stop infiltrators. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same Solomon Island scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack weeks earlier, moved across the lines pointing out enemy infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone became a key figure in the defense. When his machine gun crews were killed or wounded, he kept the guns running alone, mowing down wave after wave. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor. By dawn on September 13th, the ridge was still in Marine hands. Kawaguchi had failed to break through, but he was not finished. He still had reserves and ordered the attack to resume the next night. Colonel Merritt Edson pulled his men back to the ridge's center to tighten the lines. General Vandegrift reinforced them, bringing the total force to about 2,500 Marines. The night of September 13th to 14th was even worse than the first. Kawaguchi threw every remaining soldier into the fight, determined to break through before the defenses became impossible to penetrate. Japanese troops stormed the ridge and repeated charges, dying by the hundreds under the machine gun fire. Some got within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. The situation grew so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. By sunrise on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive collapsed. His troops were broken. Between 830 and 850 Japanese soldiers were killed in 2 nights of fighting. Marine losses totaled about 104 killed and over 200 wounded. From that day forward, the ridge was remembered as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, a symbol of the power of well-prepared American defenses. For the Japanese who survived, the defeat was another shock. Diaries and reports later described the same bitter realization. They had expected to win with night fighting, infiltration, and close combat, where training and fighting spirit mattered most. Instead, they ran into precise artillery, concentrated mortar fire, and overlapping machine gun fields of fire. The Americans knew exactly where they were coming from, and waited until they entered the trap before destroying them. The battles of Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set the pattern for the rest of Guadalcanal. Japanese attacks leaned on courage, surprise, and hand-to-hand skill. American defenses relied on overwhelming firepower, combined arms, and careful preparation. The results repeated again and again. Japanese losses were catastrophic. American losses were painful but manageable. Yet numbers alone cannot explain the misery of Guadalcanal. The island itself was a deadly enemy. Malaria struck nearly everyone who stayed more than a few weeks. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division recorded more than 8,000 malaria cases. At one point, 2/3 of the division was sick or weakened by disease. Dysentery was common, fungal infections rotted skin, jungle rot caused open wounds that never healed. Even untreated dental infections became life-threatening. For the Japanese, the conditions were worse. From the start, supplies never arrived in adequate amounts. The Tokyo Express could bring men but rarely enough food or medical gear. Soldiers survived on scraps they could find, stretched thin by occasional rice deliveries. Starvation became routine. Quinine to fight malaria ran out quickly and was never replenished. Wounded men often died from infection because no medicines were available. Captured reports from Japanese medical officers in October painted a grim picture. More than 60% of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal was crippled by disease or malnutrition. Combat strength had fallen to 30% of what it should have been. Deaths reached 50 men per day, most from starvation and sickness, not combat. Meanwhile, American supply lines improved. Protected by Henderson Field's aircraft during the day, transport ships brought food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacements. There were shortages in August and September, but by October, deliveries had become steady. The contrast was absolute. One side fought with reliable supplies and medical care. The other withered away in hunger and disease. Marines lived on canned rations that, though far from tasty, delivered enough calories and nutrition to keep them going. Ammunition was steady. Machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore out and then simply request replacements. Medical support was advanced for the time. Field hospitals had surgical units. Plasma was available for blood transfusions. Sulfur drugs helped fight infection, and badly wounded men were evacuated to rear area hospitals when possible. For the Japanese, conditions were the opposite. Supplies depended on what could fit on destroyer decks or slip through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that troops were ordered to fire only when absolutely necessary. Medical care was almost non-existent. A lucky man might get a bandage, an unlucky one faced amputation without anesthesia, and many died when untreated wounds became infected. Severely wounded soldiers were often left behind with grenades, expected to kill themselves rather than slow down their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest offensive of the campaign. General Harukichi Hyakutake came to Guadalcanal to take command personally, bringing elements of the 2nd Division, including veterans from the war in China. The plan aimed at coordinated attacks from several directions, with the main push coming from the south through the same jungle terrain used in the assault on Bloody Ridge. This time, the Japanese had more manpower, tighter coordination, and artillery finally delivered by destroyer runs. The offensive opened on October 23rd with a west side probe. 9 Japanese tanks, a rare sight on Guadalcanal due to transport difficulties, tried to force a crossing at the Matanikau River. Waiting for them were newly arrived troops of the 164th Infantry Regiment, backed by anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank. Within minutes, all 9 Japanese tanks were destroyed, and the attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main strike came during the night of October 24th-25th. Roughly 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked south of Henderson Field. They hit the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, supported by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting became legendary. Japanese troops attacked in waves through the night. Breakthroughs were sealed by immediate Marine counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then switched to rifles and kept fighting. The 11th Marines fired artillery so close it exploded almost on top of American lines. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington waited to deliver gunfire support if needed. At one point, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field. They did not yield. Sergeant John Basilone, already famous from Bloody Ridge, again played a decisive role. When ammunition ran dangerously low for his machine gun teams, he carried supplies through enemy fire, kept his guns operational, and even repaired weapons while under attack. At one point, he used a .45 pistol to lead a counterattack that retook a lost gun position. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was killed by machine gun fire during one of the night assaults. More than 2,000 Japanese troops died in the fighting. American losses numbered several hundred killed and wounded, serious but manageable. Meanwhile, the seas around Guadalcanal erupted in some of the fiercest naval battles of the war. From November 12th to 15th, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal raged for 4 days. On November 13th, in a chaotic nighttime clash, U.S. cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Both American admirals on scene, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, were killed, the only U.S. flag officers lost in surface combat during the war. The U.S. Navy lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more destroyers badly damaged. But the Japanese failed in their mission. Henderson Field remained intact. On the night of November 14th-15th, the battleship Kirishima tried again to bombard the airfield. This time, USS Washington and USS South Dakota intercepted. Guided by radar, Washington fired 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at point-blank range, sinking her with massive loss of life. The Americans also smashed a Japanese convoy trying to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and all were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before unloading fully. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the disaster. This was the last major attempt to reinforce the island with a properly equipped force. For the Japanese already trapped on Guadalcanal, November marked the collapse of hope. They expected reinforcements and supplies. Instead, they learned that their navy had failed, their convoys had been destroyed, and no more help was coming. Rations were cut again. Starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies, already scarce, disappeared entirely. Makeshift hospitals filled with the sick and wounded, where doctors could do little but watch them die. Captured Japanese diaries tell of this slow descent. Entries describe rice reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading unchecked, corpses burned when men still had the strength, soldiers eating grass, bark, even poisonous plants. Starvation and illness hollowed them into shadows of fighting men. By December, Tokyo recognized reality. From their headquarters at Rabaul, Japanese commanders ordered evacuation. Publicly, they would never admit defeat, but privately they knew that to continue meant the destruction of the 17th Army. By early 1943, only about 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained from a peak of 36,000. Of those, perhaps 7,000 were still able to walk. The rest were crippled by disease, wounds, or starvation. Operation K, the evacuation plan, became one of Japan's rare successful operations on Guadalcanal. Over 3 nights in February 1943, Japanese destroyers managed to extract 10,652 men. It was a remarkable achievement under fire, but it could not disguise the scale of defeat. Overall, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal suffered 25,000 to 30,000 deaths, about 14,800 in combat, and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American losses, while painful, were far lighter. Around 1,600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and thousands more disabled temporarily by tropical diseases. Unlike Japan, America had the industry and manpower to replace every loss. The battle for Guadalcanal was over. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, proving that Japan could be stopped and that the U.S. could endure. New divisions were already in training. American factories were producing ships and planes faster than they were being destroyed. From this point on, the strategic momentum had permanently shifted. The impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking was enormous. For the first time, their forces had been defeated in a prolonged ground battle. Every offensive had ended in failure. Every effort to apply traditional Japanese tactics had brought disastrous losses. The realization that the Americans were not only better supplied but also well-trained, well-led, and able to endure terrible hardships broke apart many of Japan's pre-war beliefs. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or gave interviews highlighted several key lessons. First, they admitted they had badly underestimated American fighting ability. Second, the gap in equipment and supplies was far greater than their intelligence had suggested. Third, their logistics system was completely unfit for a drawn-out war against an enemy that controlled both the sea and the skies. Finally, they learned that courage and tactical skill meant little against overwhelming firepower and resources. Many survivors reflected that before Guadalcanal they had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more easily, and prided themselves on night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal they saw that wars are won by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: supply, medical care, artillery support, and air coordination. Every one of those systems worked. Japanese systems collapsed because they had never been designed to sustain a campaign of this scale. The surviving veterans gave detailed testimony that often contradicted Japan's official wartime explanations for defeat. They admitted that American troops defended superbly at night in fortified positions. They acknowledged that U.S. forces endured malaria, dysentery, and brutal conditions while remaining combat effective because their supply lines supported them. They recognized that American firepower was not only superior, but coordinated and delivered with precision. They observed that a single American battalion could unleash more firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical differences in weapons were clear. Japanese soldiers carried Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons that had to be manually cycled after every shot. American Marines began with M1917 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but were soon reinforced with the M1 Garand. The Garand's 8-round magazine and semi-automatic operation gave the Marines a major edge in firefights. The gap was even wider with machine guns. The U.S. M1917A1 Browning, water-cooled, could fire continuously as long as water and ammunition lasted. Japanese machine guns, mainly the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more mobile, but they could not sustain fire. In defensive battles, this disadvantage was decisive. Artillery was perhaps the most important factor. The 11th Marines used M1A1 pack howitzers, 75mm weapons that could be broken down and carried through jungle terrain. They delivered fast, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could request fire missions and receive shells within minutes. Japanese artillery, by contrast, was limited, difficult to move through jungle, and constantly short of ammunition. Naval gunfire gave Americans another advantage. Destroyers and cruisers positioned offshore could pound Japanese positions or provide direct support for ground troops. With radio communication between shore observers and naval ships, their bombardments were precise. Air power eventually became the deciding factor. Operating from Henderson Field under harsh conditions, the Cactus Air Force gradually won air superiority. Marine and Army pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bombers. SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, hit Japanese positions, troop concentrations, and supply convoys. Japanese air units flying from Rabaul were forced to operate at the very edge of their range, giving them little time to fight over Guadalcanal. By January 1943, the balance of power was overwhelming. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now made up of both Marine and Army divisions, launched a final offensive. With massive backing from artillery, airstrikes, and naval bombardments, American troops steadily crushed the last Japanese defenses. Starvation, disease, and lack of ammunition left the Japanese unable to resist effectively. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated the island. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey: Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month battle was over. It marked America's first major ground victory against Japan and set the pattern for the rest of the Pacific War. For Japan, the lessons were devastating. The myth of invincible Japanese warriors had been destroyed. Courage and close combat skill could not overcome modern firepower and logistics. The night attacks and infiltration tactics that had worked in China failed against well-prepared American defenses. Logistics, once considered secondary, proved to be the foundation of sustained combat. Air and naval supremacy determined what happened on land. Some Japanese officers understood the deeper meaning. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who had visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, later wrote that Japan needed to completely rethink its war strategy. They left as starving, diseased, and broken survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later admitted that Guadalcanal was the first time they truly realized Japan would lose the war. After the war, Japanese veterans openly described how Guadalcanal changed their understanding of the conflict. Many admitted that their commanders had misled them. They had been told Americans were weak, but they discovered the opposite. U.S. forces were strong not only because of weapons, but because of organization, logistics, and leadership. Japanese troops fought with bravery and skill, but it was not enough. The Americans fought with systems and resources that Japan simply could not match. From the American side, the campaign carried different lessons. For Marines and soldiers, Guadalcanal proved that U.S. forces could equal Japanese troops in the unforgiving conditions of jungle warfare. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. American defensive tactics worked. Combined arms coordination proved effective, and well-trained U.S. soldiers could defeat Japanese troops in direct combat. Yet the Americans also gained respect for their opponents. They saw firsthand that Japanese soldiers would fight to the end, endure starvation, and refuse surrender even when defeat was certain. One of the starkest differences came in attitudes toward prisoners. The Americans tried to encourage surrender by dropping leaflets, using radio broadcasts, and offering food and medical care to those who gave up. These efforts failed almost completely. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, most only because they were too sick or wounded to resist. Strategically, Guadalcanal had far-reaching effects. Japan's inability to retake Henderson Field and its eventual evacuation showed that its defensive perimeter could be broken. For the Allies, the campaign marked the turning point from defense to offense. America's industrial and material superiority could now be translated into battlefield victories. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end. The loss of veteran troops, trained pilots, and naval strength could not be replaced at anywhere near the speed that America was building new forces. The decision to evacuate was a quiet admission that Japan could not win a war of attrition. The men who survived carried the experience for life. U.S. Marines and soldiers from Guadalcanal later became instructors and leaders for new units, teaching lessons in jungle combat, defensive warfare, and coordination between air, sea, and ground forces. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off the island in December 1942, needed months of recovery before returning to battle. Japanese survivors had an even harsher fate. Dispersed across the Pacific, they bore the psychological weight of defeat and the knowledge that their enemy was far stronger than propaganda had claimed. Many would not survive the later campaigns as Japan's position grew weaker. The island itself remained scarred long after the battle. Wrecked planes, burned-out vehicles, abandoned gear, and unexploded shells littered the jungles and beaches for decades. Henderson Field, enlarged and modernized, became a major Allied airbase that supported further operations across the Solomon Islands. For military history, Guadalcanal became a textbook example of modern war. It showed how amphibious landings, jungle fighting, supply systems, air-ground coordination, and naval gunfire all had to work together. It proved that courage alone could not win battles. Industrial power, logistics, and technology determined outcomes. The human cost was enormous. Naval battles around Guadalcanal claimed more than 7,000 American and Japanese lives. On the island itself, American casualties totaled over 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese deaths exceeded 30,000 from combat, disease, and starvation. Countless more suffered illnesses that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Yet in military terms, the sacrifices were decisive. Guadalcanal marked the moment when the Allies seized the initiative in the Pacific. The campaign revealed two clashing approaches to war. Japan relied on the warrior spirit, believing courage could overcome material disadvantages. The United States relied on coordinated firepower, logistics, and industrial strength. Guadalcanal proved which approach prevailed. 6 months of